Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus in Secula. This is Timothy Flanders with the Meeting of Catholic. Jesus is King. I have been a musician most of my life since I was very young. My mother is a music therapist, music teacher, and she taught me piano from the age of 5. And I was trained in percussion for most of my life and self-taught other instruments. And I was blessed with a very strong musical program in my school. And so I was exposed to a number of different styles, both in study, in performance, both so-called generally termed classical, jazz, Afro-Cuban, Latin, all sorts of different styles, marching band. So I went through study in music through my first year in college. And for many years, I was sort of a musical relativist in terms of aesthetics, in terms of the philosophy of aesthetics in music, meaning I believe that all forms of music were equally beautiful, equally good, and I had been exposed both sort of academically through my schooling to all sorts of different forms of music, studying it and performing it, but also in my own personal study and learning guitar, learning further instruments to explore all sorts of different styles, from bluegrass to bebop to blues to all sorts of things. And so learning these different styles, I've been exposed to them. And eventually, as time went on, I came to a different conclusion than this sort of musical relativism. And in my book, City of God versus City of Man, I made an interesting discovery that I did not realize. And I'm just going to talk about that today briefly to introduce this concept. And the concept is shamanic music, or what I term in the book regarding the 20th century phenomenon is popular shamanism. So I'm going to just break down what this is in this show as a preview for the book. The book is, once again, City of God versus City of Man. You can receive a free advance copy if you become a patron, patreon.com/Meaning of Catholic. And I am also going to release a essay called The Logos of Music, which is going to break down more in a more precise fashion some of the things that I'll talk about today. And then I'll also have another video where we'll talk more precisely about music, and you may even hear me produce the music that we're trying to discuss. So stay tuned for that video in the future. But when we talk about, I'll talk about shamanic music in a minute, but first what we have to talk about is, what is music according to natural law and custom? So if we look at all sorts of different cultures and societies across the world, we can perceive that there are certain elements that make up what is music according to the natural law and custom. So the most conspicuous form of music across all cultures is sacred music. Sacred music has various chanting, and it is set apart. It's not music that is done for any other purpose except in the context of the cultus, of the worship of a particular society or culture. When they are worshiping the divine, they do this music, which is some sacred form of chanting or things of that nature. So it is a sacred music, sacred in the sense of it is not profane. It is set apart, something that is used for this purpose. And we can perceive certain elements in that this music has an intellective nature, which raises our intellects to the divine. It's something that calls forth our intellects to something higher. It is the most beautiful form of music in any culture. because, as I discuss in the book, the cultus, the religious right of a society, is meant to express the metaphysical beauty of logos, the metaphysical beauty of the divine. And so the cultus is filled with audible and visual beauty. The society will produce the most beautiful textiles, the most beautiful architecture, and the most beautiful music to combine it into their cultus to offer to the divine. And this is what forms its sacred character. So the sacred music is easy to spot in all sorts of cultures and societies. And of course, in Christendom, we have various forms of sacred music. We have the various chanting traditions. Obviously, Gregorian chant is well known among Roman Catholics. And then you have other forms of Western chant, like Ambrosian chant. And then in the East, we have the so-called Byzantine chant or Greek chant, which is similar also to the Coptic chant. And then when the Mohammedans invade, they actually adopt these chanting styles. So if you've ever been in a Mohammedan country, they will often have recordings of the chanting of the Quran, and it's just an imitation of the beauty that already existed in the East at the time of the Mohammedan invasion. So they adopted this beauty and they tried to make it into their chanting of the Quran. The Greek chanting tradition then is transferred especially into the Slavic Christendom. And so then there's the Slavic chanting, which then was suppressed by the Nikon reforms, which created the modern Russian chant, which you may have heard. But you cannot hear the Slavonic chant unless you have to search for what's called Old Believer chant. But it's a very beautiful chant. If you can look it up on YouTube, Old Believer chant, and you can hear the old Slavonic Russian chant that is still chanted among the Old Believers today in Russia. So the sacred music, I'm going to get back to some of the history of sacred music in just a minute, but in general, we're basically just kind of oversimplifying here. But the biggest difference is between the sacred music and then we might call it profane music or the vulgar music, or the more positive way to say it is the Volk music. That's VOLK in the German term of that usage. Volk means the people in German. And so I'm not saying folk music because folk music is an actual genre which talks, evokes Bob Dylan or whatnot. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about on a cultural level, Volk, VOLK, Volk music. This refers to non-sacred music which is used by the community of people for various purposes. So singing around the campfire, singing the stories of your people, or singing a lullaby to your child. There's war music, which helps the soldiers march into battle. Some of these forms of folk music have lyrics, and some of them do not. Some of them are merely styles of dance music, where there's traditional dancing involved. And what you notice with these forms of folk music is, one, they are still very intellective. They still have a strong intellective content because they are either ordered towards a rational purpose, i.e., marching into battle or bringing the community together or various rational purposes, or they have such a strong lyrical content. There's 8 stanzas, for example, or something like that. Various forms of ballads, which have such long lyrics that it's very intellective because everyone remembers all these lyrics, these stories that are sung in these ballads. And there's often a lot more rhythm involved in these forms of folk music. But what we notice as a percussionist, what I notice when I listen to these different forms of folk music, and you can go on YouTube and you can find tradition, and what you would need to search for is traditional folk music. Traditional folk music, you can just punch in any country. Just go to YouTube, traditional folk Chinese music, traditional folk Russian music, traditional folk African music, traditional folk Native American music, whatever. And what's very interesting is that they all have the same quality of rhythm. The rhythm is on what's called the downbeat. The downbeat is the first beat of a measure, whether that's in 3/4 or 4/4 or 6/8. It's the first beat. So it's the first. So if we talk about 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4, it's on the 1, for example. As I said, we will actually make some of this music because I need to demonstrate some of this in terms of the rhythm, but that'll be in the future. But the downbeat, or we might say, if it's essentially a natural rhythm, because it emphasizes the beginning of the phrase, the beginning of the measure. And that this is true in all sorts of folk music, American folk music. It's true everywhere you go. In fact, if any listeners have an example of traditional folk music that does not exhibit this, please share it, because I've never found it as far as I can tell. As far as I can tell, it doesn't exist. So this is the interesting characteristic of this traditional folk music, this folk music, in whatever purpose you find it in communities, is that it exhibits the natural rhythm. And what we see is that there are these three aspects to music. There is the rhythm, there is the melody, and then there's the harmony. And so this natural rhythm is what forms the basis for the melody and the harmony. So because it's natural, it's emphasizing the phrase of the music, the melody of the music. It's emphasizing the melody. So the rhythm basically points to the melody, and that's what makes it intellective. It is pointing to something intellectual, whether that's an instrumental melody, or it is lyrical content, or it's merely traditional dance. It is pointing to the way that the music is moving melodically, and the rhythm serves as the basis for this. So it's sort of this foundation, and the reason it's a foundation is because it's natural. Now, there is another form of music, however. There's a third form of music, which is not according to Logos. And this is the music of shamanism. Shamanism has never, except in the Korean civilization, to my knowledge. Again, if anyone knows otherwise, please let me know. I have not found any civilization which actually made shamanism the basis of their civilization, except the Koreans. So the Korean civilization did have a state-sponsored shamanism, but otherwise, shamanism is quite universal. It exists in the Americas, in Europe, in Africa, Asia. All the continents have shamanism, but shamanism was most often seen as something that is practiced by a shaman who comes to practice this shamanic music. And what we see, what's interesting about this, the musical style, again, you can look at shamanic music from all these different peoples. And then what you notice is that there is also a common musical element in shamanic music. And the shamanic music emphasizes the rhythm above all else. It's sort of a throbbing rhythm. And then the melody is very much a droning or moaning. And what we notice is that this music is very emotional. This music is designed to invoke an emotional state. And that's what shamanism is. Shamanism is trying to evoke and create an emotional state of mind in order to invoke the fallen spirits to come take control. That's what shamanism is as a religion. And that's universally practiced, as I said, in all sorts of peoples. So we see that there are these elements of shamanic music where this emphasis on the rhythm above all else, not as a basis for the melody, but rather as a method of creating an emotional state. Now, what's very interesting is that we look at Africa. So Africa is a particular climate which has lots of animals in the African sub-Saharan continent. And since there's a lot of animals, there's a lot of animal skins, which means there's the capability of making lots of drums. And so what we observe in the African civilizations, so if you look at the Ethiopian civilization, the Mali Empire, and you look at these forms of music, you notice that what they've done is they've actually created a melody out of the rhythm itself. So they actually have so much drumming in traditional African music is that they've created these drum orchestras, which are putting together all these different forms of percussion into a complex melody of rhythm. And that is very much a unique musical style, which to my knowledge, again, I have not seen this particular melodic rhythmic content really anywhere else you go, because anywhere else you go, to a large degree, the rhythm serves merely as this basic foundation of the melody and rhythm and harmony. But in Africa, you have sort of a heightening of the form of rhythm, so that it is sort of a higher form of rhythm. It's not merely the basis for the melody and harmony, but it's sort of a higher melodic rhythm, if you will. So there's a high degree of beauty in this rhythmic content among the Africans. But just like everywhere else you go, you still have the shamanism as well. So you've got the shamanism that's just trying to create an emotional state and all that. But then you also have this higher form of rhythm. So the progression, just briefly, the progression of Western music continues along these lines with these three forms of music at the conversion and the baptism of these different European peoples. You have forms of shamanism, druidism, and various things like that. And then you have the folk music, and then you have the sacred music. And this develops, and as Europe is baptized and converted and Christendom is formed, the shamanic music dies away because the society is baptized and shamanism becomes ostracized, and it becomes a shunned folk practice. And so this is died away in Western Europe. And then out of the sacred music is formed the first great synthesis of music, comes out of the Gregorian chant and becomes polyphony. And this is one of the great outgrowths of Western culture, is the development of polyphony, which is an entirely different musical style than Gregorian chant. But it is no less sacred. And that is one of the most beautiful things about this production and this synthesis of the sacred music into another form. But then you also have this strong dose of paganism that comes with the Renaissance. And the church then rebaptizes this paganism that gets reinfused into the Western society. And this becomes Baroque music. And Baroque music exhibits all of the greatness of the Renaissance, baptized with the sacred character of the music. And so then you have things like Vivaldi's great works, with Bach's great works in the Baroque era. So there's this Baroque music, which has a strong sacred content, has a strong sacred element, but it is becoming more popular in the sense that it is becoming to be more it is being played more in the context of performance. So in a concert, that's becoming more prominent with the Baroque, but there's still a strong sacred content. Now, by the time you get to the classical period, now roughly we're talking about the 1700s here. Now, these are scholars are going to debate about different periods, but we're just simplifying everything. So if you say Baroque, we could maybe call Baroque 1600s and then classical 1700s. So obviously we're oversimplifying this, but the classical period is when the Western music becomes more secularized. And so the sacred element in classical music, and classical music in English is vernacularly used to refer to all forms of music from basically 1600 to 1900, but that's not technically the term that we use. The terms that are typically used are Baroque, classical, and romantic. So the classical form of music is most often associated with greats like Mozart. So the sacred element that you saw in the spirit of Baroque music is largely absent, but there's still a strong sacred context. So Mozart still writes masses, which are still performed into the 20th century with great spiritual benefit. There's in Joseph Ratzinger's biography, he talks about hearing mass with a mass of Mozart, and it's still has a still strong spiritual content. But in the spirit of this music, in the classical spirit in Mozart, there's a very strong secularizing content and it's analogous to the scientific revolution, to this mechanization of reality, this confidence that we can just build this new society. These are the ideas in the 1700s, which are influencing the spirit of the music, classical music. And then we have the Romantic period. The Romantic period is a reaction very much to the revolutions of France, which are so secular that there's no room for the human spirit of emotion, of the beauty of nature. And the Romantic spirit is sort of re-injecting these spiritual elements, which had sort of been squeezed out in the classical period. And so then you have the, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which has secular lyrics, but the musical style itself is so spiritual that the melody of the Ninth Symphony, Fourth Movement, is made into a hymn. And so there are these spiritual aspects that are reinserted into the Romantic period. Now, while this is happening, you have the Catholic Caribbean. And in the Catholic Caribbean, there's the poison of Mohammedanism, which is injected and poisons the Christendom of the Americas. And this poison is racial slavery, which the Mohammedans practiced for 1,000 years, and the Europeans finally succumbed to the temptation to go into Africa and destroy African families and take men, women, and children from Africa to the Catholic Caribbean. The church always condemned this, but the church was unable to stop wicked Catholics from profaning the name of Christ in this wicked manner. And so they brought the Africans to the Catholic Caribbean, and many of these Africans, the African slave trade was an alliance between Black African empires and Western European powers. And then the Black African empires would go into, the bush and villages and whatnot. They would get Africans who were less civilized in the higher civilizations of African civilizations, and they would overcome them and take them to the Catholic Caribbean. And so they brought along with them various forms of shamanic music, particularly West African voodoo music, which is a form of this shamanic music that we've discussed. But at the same time, they still had this higher form of this African rhythmic melody. And so, in more healthy areas of the Caribbean, there was a development of a synthesis of the African and European musical elements. And this is something that develops slowly over time through the influence of the Catholic rite of Mass, which develops and begins to cleanse the society of shamanic elements as it did in Western Europe before. And so this is something that develops in various places. You have the Afro-Cuban style in Cuba. You have the Haitian musical style. You have the New Orleans musical style. And these are all Catholic forms which are growing through this synthesis of European and African styles. But it is done, and it takes time, it takes generations to cleanse the shamanic elements. But there is this beautiful melding which is happening between this unique African rhythmic melodic style with the European elements, particularly in New Orleans. However, that process of the Catholic formation of the African and European styles is arrested by the American Empire, which takes over the city of New Orleans around 1800 with the purchase, the Louisiana Purchase. And so the public cultus of the Roman Catholic Mass is suppressed in New Orleans. So after 1800, and then they also impose the American racial ideologies. And so the mixing of these cultures begins to decline, especially after the Second Civil War, the 1860s Civil War of the American Empire. And what ends up happening is that the shamanic elements in New Orleans culture are harnessed beginning in the 1900s, and especially after the First World War. And what happens is, this is something we discuss more in my book. We talk more about the social, political elements at work here. But at the dawn of the so-called Jazz Age is taking the Catholic culture of New Orleans that had been grown organically, despite the poison of slavery, had begun to grow organically. It becomes, in the Jazz Age, a form of popular shamanism, because what is discovered is that people discover that they can make a ton of money if they can create music which is shamanic in character. Once again, shamanic, as we discussed, traditionally in all sorts of cultures, is about creating a thrusting beat and a moaning melody. So that it's just creating an emotional state of being, which the shaman then invokes the demons. So it's creating this sort of irrational state of mind where you're just emotionally charged, you're just over emotional, and you're attached to these musical forms that are being produced by the shaman, and then the shaman can invoke the demons to take control. And the same exact form begins to proliferate in the jazz era. Now, there are other forms of jazz which are able to preserve the beauty of that Catholic synthesis that was begun. And so there's higher forms of jazz, which are higher forms of art and beauty, but those begin to lose their profitability, because the love of money is what's generating this shamanism. And so what gets promoted popularly in the dance halls and whatnot is this form called jazz, which is a slang term for fornication. And alcohol and sensual dancing. And this begins to develop popular shamanism. And that culturally is what I believe we should term popular music of today, because it exhibits the same elements of shamanism of old in all these sorts of cultures, namely that thrusting beat and moaning melody. And this is what develops finally the backbeat. The backbeat is a reversal of that natural form of rhythm, which emphasizes the melody and becomes this. So it's not the natural form of rhythm in the European styles or in other traditional folk musics, nor is it the African complex rhythmic melody either. The backbeat is the reversal of the foundational rhythmic structure. It is something that allows the listener to emphasize the rhythm above everything else. And so the backbeat it's an emphasis on the backbeat, not the downbeat. So 1, 2, 3, 4, in a measure of 4/4 music, 1, 2, 3, 4, it is an emphasis on 2 and 4. And you if you listen to any popular music, all the popular musics have the backbeat. The backbeat is the foundation of all popular music, because all of this popular music is popular shamanism, which is designed to create an emotional state, to create an attachment of the listener to the music, which is an emotional attachment to make money. And this could be the most harmless form of that, which is just, some quality country music or something like that with good lyrics or whatever, but it's just trying to create this emotional attachment to make money. Or it could be the far worse forms of that, which are promoting in their lyrics all sorts of things. Also, forms of music which are particularly thrusting beats and moaning melodies, which have this shamanic quality, which are sort of creating this degrading form of shamanic music, which promotes fornication and sin by its very nature, by the nature of the music itself, not even the lyrics, the nature of that shamanic quality. And so this is the popular shamanism of today. And this is why I believe your spiritual life will be benefited if you stop listening to shamanic music. So in a future video, we're going to actually talk a lot more in detail, and we'll provide examples on the actual, so you can actually listen to this. So I can give you examples to actually listen to, because I'm just describing it right now. But this is just a preview for what I talk about in the book and what we'll talk about in the future regarding the logos of music. So once again, please become a patron. Patreon.com/meaningofcatholic. You will get the free advanced copy of the book. You can also get other books as well. We're also going to have patron-only shows coming up. We'll have Tradcat Night, the podcast. That'll be a patron-only show. And then we'll also have a discussion about the binding character of Vatican II. And we'll talk about that. That'll be patron-only as well. So we will be having these shows, and I want to thank you to all patrons for supporting this apostolate. So hope this is helpful. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them. Again, if you have any traditional folk music that does not have a natural rhythm, please send it to me, because I've never found it. And if it exists, then it would seem to be an exception to the general principles that I'm giving here. So please comment and provide any questions that you'd like to address. So thanks a lot. Let's offer up an Our Father at the end of this for the sake of our spiritual lives, to always offer up to God a pure sacrifice of praise, and offering the music so that the music may always be pleasing to the Lord, whether that's for sacred purposes or for just eutrapelia, right recreation, but to offer him what is pleasing to him according to logos. One text that I've used quite a bit is Dietrich von Hildebrand, Aesthetics. Has only recently been brought into English, and so this is the one of the texts that I relied on heavily in my book. So if you want to dig deeper into these topics, Dietrich von Hildebrand is the place to start. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater noster qui es in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos debitimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Jesus is King.